Hi, and welcome to the program. I'm Bob Crimmins, and this is Living in the West. And Living in the West is a television program, but it's also a magazine. It's a free giveaway magazine, and you can find it at Safeway grocery stores or LeBou coffee shops. You could even go over to UC Davis, and in their cafeteria, they have copies of it. And I have a copy of it myself right here, and this is just one of the items that we wrote about. We're going to be doing a lot of television programs today. I'm really anxious to hear this one myself because it has to do with us here in California. In fact, if I were to ask you what the bear on the California state flag represented, would you know? Or why are those big gold bears out there at Cal Expo? Could you give me an answer? Do you know why they're placed out there? Well, we're going to find out today, and you're going to be really surprised when you hear the answers. So I've invited the best guest that knows all about this stuff. His name is Steve Beck. He's from Sutter's Fort, and he's graciously said that he'd join us today and tell us this entire story. So mostly it's going to be Steve telling you this story. I'm still going to be here right next to him, but I want him to have most of the program so that you can really understand this issue. It's that important. So Steve, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us. And like I said, this is a very important issue, I think, that people should know about our California state flag.
Well, yes, thank you, and thanks to Living in the West magazine for inviting me to share the story of a little-known but very important event in California history. Our story begins, well, there's a little-known fact that in 1846, Mexico had an immigration problem. Illegal aliens from the United States were streaming across the border, and the Mexicans were wondering how to stop it. But our story begins a little before that. In 1839, a Swiss entrepreneur and adventurer named John Sutter came into the Sacramento Valley. He was hoping to build a permanent settlement where he would attract people to live on his land, and he would eventually have an agricultural empire, and people would have to come to him to purchase all their goods. At first, he had trouble attracting people to his land, but then he built a fort. And once he built the fort, it gave people the pretense of safety, whether they needed safety from presumably hostile Indians or wild animals or the Mexican government that might at some time come to take back the land they had freely given to Sutter. At any rate, he had to build a fort. But the only way that Sutter could make money was to attract people to live on his land. And in order to do that, he actually hired basically real estate agents. He took mainly trappers that had been displaced by the failing fur trade, but they knew all of the routes west. So he sent them east to intercept wagon trains that were headed to the Oregon Territory. Now, at this time, the Oregon Territory was jointly held by the United States and England. But Mexico owned California. So Sutter would have these trappers intercept wagon trains and bring them to Sutter's Fort so that they could become Mexican citizens and own property in California. Thereby, Sutter would attract business people to purchase things from his trading post, and at the same time, the value of the land would go up because of the number of people arriving there. But Sutter took it one step further. The trappers weren't the best salesmen. They might have been good guides, but they weren't the best people persons. So there was a lawyer, a man named Lansford Hastings. Lansford Hastings decided that he would write a book and explain to people the values of coming to California and how to get to California. He pointed out where all of the streams were along the way, where you could find grass for your cattle, and he promised Sutter over 1,000 wagons that year by writing an immigrant's guide to California and Oregon. But really, it was an immigrant's guide to California, and it was hugely successful. So successful that in 1846, it was a traffic jam of wagons, essentially, from St. Joe, Missouri, or Independence, wherever your starting point was, all the way to Sutter's Fort. This was a problem for the Mexicans, because everywhere they looked, suddenly here was there were more Americans or people from the United States suddenly in Mexican California than there were Mexicans. And it became a problem. The man that you're looking at right now on the screen is Juan Alvarado. He was a governor of California. He's the governor that gave Sutter and many other Europeans and Americans land grants within California in the early days of giving out these land grants. The Mexicans stopped it. As a matter of fact, Alvarado was removed from his governorship in 1842 by the official Mexican government in Mexico because they felt that he was giving out too many land grants. And they appointed a governor themselves, a man named Manuel Michel Tarina. Well, that caused a revolution. The people of California weren't used to having the official government of Mexico City appoint governors for them. And in 1845, there was a revolution fought in California, and Alvarado had been removed, and now Michel Tarina was removed. And suddenly the governor of California was Pio Pico, who lived in the south. But the government, the capital, the customs house, which was the sole source of money for the government, was still in the north, in Monterey. So you've got this confusing system of power existing in California. The north and the south are separated with the governor in one spot and the capital in another, and there's confusion over who's in charge. And in 1841, little before this, the Americans even recognized that. And they tried to rebel against the Mexican government that early. It was Alvarado who eventually put down that revolution. But you still had this confusing system of power. Who was in charge? As a matter of fact, in 1846, there was an army from the south marching north to fight another revolution over control of California. One of the men that you just looked at was Jose Castro. He was the man that was in charge of the cavalry in California, the Mexican cavalry. And he was the one who was fearful most of the American migration. So fearful that in April of 1846, he ordered everyone who was not a Mexican citizen to leave California, and he forbade the importing of any other new people into California to receive citizenship. Well, as you can imagine, this angered a lot of the people in California, and all of those people that you saw in that train of wagons who were coming to California. This man is Mariano Vallejo. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was in charge of the Mexican army in California. Now, Castro was in charge of the cavalry. Vallejo is in charge of the army. And he had taken and fortified the barracks at what had been the old mission at Sonoma, and he had turned it into the Mexican headquarters of the Northern Department of the Army of Mexico. So it was an arsenal. They had stored weapons there. There was a contingent of the Mexican army there that we'll talk about in just a moment. But it was fear that had been generated through Castro's proclamation and the fact that they were going to order Americans out of California that precipitated ill feelings among the newly arrived immigrants and even the established immigrants. So fearful that they bound themselves together in a loose-knit militia to possibly challenge the government of Mexico if it became necessary. They adopted the grizzly bear as a symbol of what they stood, for what they stood. And at this time, grizzly bears were prominent in California. The last one was killed outside of Sequoia National Park in 1923. But in the mid-19th century, grizzly bears were everywhere. They were strong, and they did not back down in the face of their enemy. And this was the symbol that Los Osos, or the bears, adopted. The bears were primarily Americans, but they were also represented by other Europeans living in and around Sutter's Fort and around the Sonoma area. This particular man we're looking at now is Martin Murphy. He had come to California in 1844. He was the first one to bring wagons successfully into California. But Martin Murphy had called on the rest of his family to join him. They were part of the migration of 1846. They were in those thousands of wagons strung out along the trail between Missouri and California. And now Martin Murphy finds out that his relatives can't join him after all. They're not going to be allowed to come into California because of Jose Castro's proclamation. Martin Murphy had actually been working with the Mexican government. He allowed government horses to be stored on his land or to have free range on his land. And it was to his land that Jose Castro sent a lieutenant and a small company of about 8 soldiers. The man's name was Francisco Arce. They were going to gather these horses, the government horses, to be used by the cavalry to possibly drive Americans out of California and to prevent Americans from entering California. Martin Murphy's caught in a dilemma. Is he to remain a good Mexican citizen and maintain his land grant, or is he to invite his American immigrant family to come to California? This man is William Knight. Now, Martin Murphy's land was along the Cosumnes River. William Knight had land where Knight's Landing is today in Yolo County. William Knight's cousin or wife was named Carmela Arce Knight. She was the cousin of Francisco Arce. And Francisco Arce and his troops stayed overnight at the Knight's house. And it was while he was staying there that he told his cousin and her husband, William, about the intervention of the Mexicans to drive Americans out of California. Upon hearing this, William Knight, a good American, but now a Mexican citizen, knowing he could not be joined by his family, went to Sutter's Fort. He's frequently called the Paul Revere of the Bear Flag Rebellion. It was William Knight who brought the word that the Mexicans might attack. And based upon that information, this loose group of American militia called Los Osos, or the Bears, decided to take action before the Mexican government. They went out to Martin Murphy's ranch. They captured Francisco Arce and all of the government horses. They allowed Arce and his men to have 1 horse each to return to Monterey. The rest of the horses they brought together for their own use. And their purpose was to attack the Mexican military headquarters at Sonoma. Now, we call it the Mexican military headquarters, but it was also the home of Mariano Vallejo. One of those people living there was his wife, who you see on the screen now, Francesca Benicia Vallejo. Now, you may remember there is a town, Benicia. It was once the capital of the state of California, but for a very brief time. Vallejo had donated land and named the town after his wife with the idea that it would become the capital. She was there at the home. This is Jacob Lease. Jacob Lease, that doesn't sound very Hispanic, does it? No, he was an American, but he was living there at the Vallejo home because he'd married one of Vallejo's sisters. So even though it's the Northern Department of Mexico headquarters of the Army, it's also family members that are spread out there at this home. Well, on June 15th, in the pre-dawn hours, this ragtag bunch of Americans calling themselves the Bears, dressed in their own clothes, using their own weapons, and using horses that they'd stolen from the Mexican government, attack Sonoma, and in one day conquer the entire Northern Department of Mexico's army. Of course, reports at the time suggest that there were probably 11 or 12 men in that army. So it wasn't much of an attack. The Americans had somewhere between 20 and 30 men, but they took possession of Vallejo's house, and they shared freely in his brandy cellar, his wine cellar, and arrested his family members, including the American Jacob Lease, as well as any other Mexican contingent that were there. And they were taken to Sutter's Fort and imprisoned in the barracks. So why, though, did the Americans have this courage to act in the middle of Mexico? That's because of the man that we're going to see right here. This is Captain John C. Fremont. And Captain Fremont was an American explorer, but in June of 1846, he was in California. He had already engaged in a small battle with Jose Castro. There were no deaths in this battle, but it set the stage for the Americans to think that they had the support of the American army, because John Fremont was here filibustering around the state with about 63 hardened mountain men who had been selected for their ability to shoot a gun rather than their ability to draw maps. He belonged to the Topographic Corps. But Fremont gave the Americans the confidence to act, thinking that they would be supported. And of course, Fremont had with him Kit Carson, famous mountain man, famous Indian fighter, and just the presence of Kit Carson alone, a man who was famous in his own time, gave the Americans courage. Little known, but Kit Carson was responsible for some of the few deaths that happened during the Bear Flag Rebellion. There were a couple of Americans named Crawley and Fowler who had also been killed and possibly tortured. They also may have possibly been stealing horses, or they may have just been reconnoitering for the Americans. But Carson was reconnoitering. He went out to see if the Mexicans were planning a counterattack. And when he did, he went along San Pablo Bay and he saw a large rowboat that contained Grandpa Berryessa and the Dajaro twins. And Carson determined that they did not have the time or the energy to take prisoners, so they were shot from a distance. And those were the most deaths associated with the Bear Flag Rebellion. We call it the Bear Flag, so I think we better see a picture of what the original Bear Flag looked like. Now, it was drawn by a man named William Todd. He was the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a first-term congressman from Illinois at this time, but his nephew, William, was here making California a free and independent nation. Could we have the flag back up there again? I want to talk about some of the different parts of the flag. It was the red star stood for the one nation, a single nation, not a part of the United States, not a part of Mexico, but the independent nation of California. They had adopted it in honor of Texas, which had been the Lone Star Republic, but was no longer the Lone Star Republic because Texas had become a state in 1845. The bear on the flag, and again, let's leave this up for just a moment on the picture of the flag. The bear on the flag, if you'll notice, does not look a whole lot like a bear. As a matter of fact, when they first raised this flag over Sonoma, the local residents called it El Puerco, or the pig. They thought it looked a lot more like a pig than it did like a bear, but it wouldn't be very popular to be from the Pig Flag Republic. The California Republic meant that it was going to be a nation of the people. The red stripe across the bottom has an interesting story. It stood for the blood that was going to be shed to keep California free and independent. But interesting about the red stripe, and there are many stories about where the fabric came from, the one that resounds most with me is it came from the underwear of a man named Uncle Billy Elliot, or William Bell Elliot. So Uncle Billy's long underwear became part of the flag. You talk about giving it all up for the rebellion. Uncle Billy's Bear Butt Revolt, frequently called. So there were other people at that accompanied the Americans. The Americans brought with them their families. Nancy Kelsey came along. But there's the Bear flag when they raised this above Sonoma. So you can see the raising of the flag. And the Americans, as I said, brought their families with them. Kelsey and Benjamin Kelsey came along. This is Nancy. Interesting about Nancy is she was also the first woman to cross the Sierra from east to west. She did it in 1841, along with 33 men, or 32 men and one child, because Nancy was pregnant and carrying her 3-year-old daughter with her. Now, every new nation needs something besides a flag. They need a president. They need a proclamation of independence. This is supposed to be William B. Ide. He was one of the few educated men. He could write. And so he wrote a proclamation of independence. And this is a rough draft of that is still in the Sutter's Fort archives. You'll notice the scratch outs that are on this, but you'll notice the date has been changed from June 14th to June 15th. That's because they'd shared so freely in General Vallejo's wine cellar that they weren't willing to listen to a reading of the proclamation at the time it was written, and they didn't actually issue it till the next day. And then they still didn't want to listen to it. This is John Bidwell. He's the founder of the city of Chico. He was a clerk for John Setter, and he wrote a much smaller version that said, "We, the undersigned, hereby agree to unite for the defense of an independent California." And that became what was adopted as the actual Declaration of Independence, because its brevity was a lot more in tune with the attitude of the people that were sitting there willing to listen, the Los Osos, who were celebrating their defeat of the Mexican army and their capture of the American citizens. And it was John Bidwell's, then this became the document that was used to recruit men to join the California Battalion. Now, at the time the Bear flag was raised, June 15th, 1846, over Sonoma, no one knew that war with Mexico had already started. In fact, war had started between the United States and Mexico in May over a question in Texas and the border of Texas. And the real war was on, but word did not reach California until July 7th. So for 24 days, from about June 14th till July 7th, the Bear Flag Republic existed, when California was not a part of the United States and not a part of Mexico, but its own nation. But on July 7th, the American Navy sailed into Monterey and they raised the American flag over the Mexican capital, and California became a military protectorate. A couple of days later, at that same flagpole, Joseph Warren Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, carried the first flag to be raised where the Bear flag had previously flew. It was the 28-star American flag. Now, Revere was on the supply ship Portsmouth, and they had left New York before Texas had become a state. And all of a sudden, Texas was a state, and their original flag only had 27 stars. So they had to add stars. And when they took the flag to Sutter's Fort, it only had 27 stars on it. So they had to call back to the Portsmouth to have a star brought up to be added. So they raised the American flag over Sutter's Fort on July 11th, thus beginning the American occupation of California and the changing of California from a state of Mexico to a military protectorate of the United States. Now, few people know that California was never a territory like Oregon or Utah or Arizona. It was simply a military protectorate, and that meant it's the job of the United States military to protect the rights of the citizens. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War is what ensured that. That treaty was passed February 2nd, 1848. Those of you who have been reading your history books would know how fortuitous that date is. That's 1 week after gold was discovered. So 1 week after the discovery of gold, California officially becomes a part of the United States. And yet, all those soldiers who were supposed to enforce the law, do you think they stayed around to enforce the law, or did they go looking for gold? And the story of the Mexican-American War, the military protectorate, the land rights, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo will be a story we'll share on another edition of Living in the West. But, one thing is, for those of you who have an interest in history, who have an interest in hearing about this, I encourage you to come to Sutter's Fort. The third Saturday of every month, except October, we have a special event that deals with a different theme in California history. It just so happens the third Saturday in June this year is June 15th. The same day they raised the Bear flag over Sonoma. And we will be celebrating war in California and talking about the Bear Flag Rebellion, the Mexican-American War. its effect upon the American citizens, the Mexican citizens, and the original owners of California, the Indians. So the third Saturday of each month, hands-on history, and I encourage you to call Sutter's Fort to find out what the themes are of our other days.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. My goodness, you know, it was interesting to me that at the time you were going to help me write a story about the Donner Party. And then you just accidentally mentioned something about the bear flag. And you said, well, a few interesting things. And I asked you, tell me more. And so you started to tell me more. And I couldn't believe what you were saying, that this all happened right here where we're sitting practically. And then I went out to find if other people knew about this too, and they didn't know either. So we're hoping that this information you've just given us will educate them too about how we came about in living in California and our state flag that flies right next to the United States flag down at the state capitol and why it's there and its history. And I think it's one of the most interesting stories I've ever written about.
Well, thank you, Bob. I hope it encourages people to learn more about their state's history. And you can do that, of course, by coming to Sutter's Fort. I'm there at each of these events. On some of these days, we open up parts of the fort that aren't open to the general public and share a little bit of the pictures from the Sutter's Fort archives. And many of the artifacts are replicas of those artifacts so that people can get a real feeling for the history. And it beats the heck out of just having a book.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Steve, for joining us today. And thank you all out there as well. And if you remember, go out, get yourself a magazine. I write about these stories as well. So you can find them at Safeway grocery stores, like I say, in a lot of different places out there. So pick up the latest version of the magazine and then join us again here. And Steve will be back with me. And we're going to be talking about the Donner Party and a few other things that I'm going to get him to educate us about. So in the meantime, thanks for everyone's attention out there, and I hope that we've managed to give you some information here and make you a whole lot smarter about this wonderful state we call California and living in the West. Thank you.